Well, that was an interesting development. For viewers watching this at some point in the future, Rafa was arrested just 2 days after the first part of this miniseries. And yes, that was a sly wink and a nudge to watch part 1 if you haven't done so already, but I'm also still reeling from the odds. So before we dive into the big character breakdown, let's look at what we know so far about one of the biggest busts in narco history. Rafael Caro Quintero was captured just 2 weeks ago, on Friday the 15th of July. He was found in the Sinaloan mountain town of San Simon, near the northern border with the state of Sonora. According to Mexican authorities, he was found hiding out in some shrubland in the town's outskirts. We're told he was caught by a sniffer dog named Max, trained and led by the Mexican Marines involved in the operation. The sight of them had prompted an unguarded Rafa, previously moving, quote, comfortably around the area, we're told, to attempt an escape. Around the same time that the arrest operation was taking place, a Black Hawk helicopter carrying a team of Marines crashed in the coastal Sinaloan town of Los Mochis, killing 14 agents on board. Official details on the incident are still unreleased. Authorities have stated the crash was an accident without any connection to Rafa's arrest. Various journalists and anti-narcotics experts have strongly doubted this, and public pressure is mounting for the Mexican authorities to release the information. In official declarations, Mexican President López Obrador and Ken Salazar, US ambassador to Mexico, stressed that the tactical operation to arrest the kingpin was exclusively a Mexican affair, without any US collaboration. The Drug Enforcement Agency, however, says otherwise. They affirm the Mexican Marines were in fact working with intel shared by the DEA. By their own account, the agency has been highly active in pursuing Rafa ever since he became a fugitive in 2013, and were not surprised that the Mexican authorities were denying them the credit. In the 9 years that they and Mexican state elements were tailing Rafa, the fugitive managed to escape arrest about a dozen times, an impossible feat without close collusion from state authorities. Based on DEA intel, allegedly sourced from anonymous relatives of Rafa, among other informants, Rafa was being housed in the area for about 3 years by a certain Adelmo Núñez Molina. Molina is the local lieutenant to Los Chapitos, the sons of jailed former drug lord Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. Rafa, we're told, had a heavily armed security detail on rotation every week. He travelled by motorbike and ATV. Intelligence officers even knew the routes he took to visit his lovers in the area. The DEA discovered his location through a new investigation opened 8 months before his capture. It's likely that they knew Rafa's approximate location for some time and were pressuring the Mexican government to act on 2 arrest warrants and a provisional arrest warrant for extradition purposes. According to one source, a quote, lack of political will has hampered the arrest effort until recently. Analysts have publicly commented that the timing of the Mexican president's visit to the White House just 3 days before Rafa's capture is unlikely to be a coincidence. It's believed President Biden, who for decades has been a high-profile crusader in the US's so-called war on drugs, likely pressured the Mexican government to capture the kingpin, with a $20 million bounty on his head. Rafa's arrest is a surprisingly encouraging development in diplomatic relations between the US and Mexico. It follows other acts of goodwill from the Mexican government following a turbulent few years under Obrador's term. One of these was the renewal of visa grants to DEA officers based in Mexico in late 2021. Visa allotments had previously been suspended and DEA operations had been restricted amid a series of diplomatic rows, mainly centering around Mexico's former Secretary of Defense. Salvador Cienfuegos had been briefly incarcerated in the US on charges of drug trafficking and money laundering. He was returned to Mexico after pressure from the government, insisting that he be tried in Mexico. When he did return, though, all criminal charges were dropped, prompting more diplomatic clashes. Rafa's arrest might be cause for renewed strain. In fact, it could get quite ugly. For one, the road to Rafa's extradition, what the US government ultimately wants, is looking long and winding. A judge in the state of Mexico has already ratified what's called a writ of protection, or an amparo, decreeing that Rafa should not be extradited until the extradition procedure is finalized, and until then that he should not be permitted to leave Altiplano prison in the state of Mexico where he is currently interned. In Mexico, an amparo is one of the best legal routes for prosecuted individuals to overturn decisions of higher courts by alleging the violation of their constitutional rights. The appeal was registered by none other than Caro Quintero's sister, Beatriz Angelica, before a district judge in the state of Jalisco. The length of the extradition process will depend on political will and how hard Caro Quintero and his team of lawyers fight back. Ultimately, though, the final decision will likely be with the Mexican government, and its relations with the US could well affect the decision. Second, the capture could ignite or reignite efforts to prosecute state officials with alleged involvement in the abduction and murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. One of these is Manuel Bartlett Diaz, former Secretary of the Interior and current protege of the Mexican president, also appointed CEO of Mexico's state-owned electric utility, to name just one. So let's see how the events unfold. If you're watching this in weeks, months or years from now and you're up to date with the latest news, thanks for sharing it in the comments down below. Alright, and now for the big breakdown. Alicia, let's go. Rafa is often seen as one of the godfathers of the Mexican marijuana trade, as the capo who transformed seedless weed from a niche commodity into a gold standard, thanks to dozens of colossal intensive farms brazenly raised across Mexico's northern deserts. Because of this, he's been regarded as a savvy criminal entrepreneur. Due to his agricultural exploits in particular, some have called him something of an ingenious visionary. His life story begs a lot of questions, though. One that constantly cropped up in my own research was this: just how apt was Caro Quintero as a businessman? Just for the record, I don't have the answer to this question. I'm going to explore it and then leave it with you to make up your own mind. We've seen his rapid rise up the drug trade, from petty peddler to intensive plantation owner and multi-billionaire by his early 30s. Part of this was Rafa always looking for the next rung up the criminal ladder, using his experience and know-how to scale up his operations and pursue exponential profits. We can probably safely assume that experience of real poverty in his youth was a constant source of motivation, as it has always been and remains today for many traffickers. His success alone shows us he's surpassed other traffickers in resourcefulness and energy, especially to have reached that stage so quickly. But then we should also remember just how well connected Rafa was. His family had been in trafficking for generations. His uncles, Emilio and Juan José Quintero Payan, were well-known marijuana and heroin traffickers. So was his uncle, Chapo Caro, as well as his cousin, Francisco Javier Caro Payan. His aunt, Manuela Caro, was a heroin cook. Many of his brothers, especially future drug lord Miguel Ángel Caro Quintero, went on to become key players in the family business. Further, by entering the drug scene of the Golden Triangle in the late 60s and 70s, Rafa fell under the wing of local kingpin Pedro Avilés Pérez as well as his contacts. They would have taught the young peddler what he wanted and needed to know if he was to move up in the trade. The rest he would have learned by observation. Ernesto Fonseca, in the game since the 1950s, was also not just a close mentor and father figure, but a well-connected and able business partner who later shared investments in many operations usually attributed to Rafa. Once Rafa was a powerful drug lord with investments in huge Sinsemilla agri-farms, it's likely most of his operations were delegated to and/or overseen by others. The businesses worked as cooperatives, and its shareholders included dozens of other traffickers, as well as members of the DFS, Mexico's special intelligence agency at the time. And Rafa's extremely limited education shouldn't be understated, however quick to learn he might have been. He didn't have more than a 6th grade education, and no more than a 1st grade education by his own account. There was an important DEA informant called Gabriel, a financial advisor to the DFS who had attended various strategy meetings with the Guadalajara clan. On the matter of Rancho Búfalo, the huge desert plantation in Chihuahua, whose bust led to the abduction of Kiki Camarena, Gabriel was quoted saying this: "Rafa couldn't have done it without the DFS. He couldn't have kept track of the money. He can't count that high." And we know this, or at least the first part of the sentence, to be true. The DFS, backed by the CEA, did invest heavily in the cartel's operations, and Rancho Búfalo in particular. Another witness, by the fake name of Antonio Vargas, commented on the events leading up to the abduction of Kiki Camarena, as well as the cover-up of his torture and murder. Rafa and Don Neto have no imagination. They were working under the orders of officials. They don't have the brains. And this was back in the 1980s. Vargas was onto something that we now know, that the elaborate logistics of Kiki's abduction and the subsequent cover-up of his brutal death were the works of high-ranking elements within the Mexican government, as well as the DFS, the police, the military, and even the CIA. The idea that the traffickers were acting with assistance and often orders from above is now well known. Even Gabriel, the witness mentioned earlier, recalled DFS agents berating Fonseca Carrillo in a meeting for his cocaine addiction and for being sloppy with his businesses. So it does make the mind wander. Rafa had the family networks, the right mentors, the ambition, and the collusion of state authorities. He definitely distinguished himself near the beginning of his rise to power, dropping business with small family-run plantations to invest in plantations of his own, for example. But then, was there a point when others really took charge? Like when the operations moved beyond perhaps the less challenging logistics of small to medium-scale trafficking to the industrial agro-farms we see later on. As we know, success breeds success. How much of that later success is an indicator of Rafa's abilities, especially given the state's enthusiastic collaboration in Mexico's most lucrative export.
Si tengo una debilidad son las mujeres y el oro.
Caro Quintero was the breathing caricature of a Mexican drug lord. He's arguably the first Mexican trafficker to gain mass public attention both at home and abroad. In doing so, he might have helped cement the stereotype of Mexican crime bosses in the popular imagination. First, he led his life in the manner you could expect from a poorly educated ranchero who gets filthy rich quick off of drug money. And that was to splash out a nice thing. In Rafa's case, this was especially on clothes, dressing like a vaquero gunslinger crossed with a 1970s rock star. His signature outfit was designer jeans and cowboy boots, the best that money could buy, as well as a tailor-made shirt, usually Italian, unbuttoned at the chest to flaunt rings and rings of golden chains. Wedged in an oversized cowboy belt was a gun worth about $500,000, encrusted with diamonds and studded with rubies, spelling out Rafa's codename R1. In 1989, the Washington Post reported on the living conditions of Rafa and other Guadalajara bosses while quote-unquote interned at the Reclusorio Norte in the suburbs of Mexico City. A modest tally of 35 new silk shirts decked his wardrobes, as well as 20 pairs of cowboy boots and a handful of sombreros from Sinaloa. And these were just his prison garbs. As you might have guessed, he was insatiably vain and never one to disguise his wealth. His ostentatiousness now fills the annals of narco literature. His signature departure, after a night of drugs and excess at Guadalajara nightclubs, was to shower $100 bills onto the dance floor and yell, "For you, mijos." He once cropped up in Tucson, Arizona to buy a Learjet. When the vendor gave him the price, Rafa gave him a check and told the vendor to fill it out. Rafa told him he didn't know how many zeros were in the price tag. We might not ever know exactly how wealthy Rafa was. It's possible he didn't know either. $500 million before he was 29, billions of dollars in Panamanian and German accounts, just to name two, in his 30s and onwards, at least 300 legitimate businesses to launder his money. His cattle business, at the start of his career at least, was one of his main front companies to traffic marijuana and heroin into the US, and he passed himself off as a successful cattle rancher. Colourful anecdotes hint at the scale of Rafa's wealth. In 1984 alone, he bought 300 Grand Marquis from a local Ford dealership, gifting them to politicians and lawmen to secure their protection. An American technician known as the White Tower because of his height and who fitted radio systems for Rafa and the Guadalajara kingpins recalled counting out $400 million in cash over the course of over a month to be paid out to a senior Mexican statesman. And Rafa was the cartel's wild card, putting him at odds with other high-ranking figures in the drug trade. Don Neto, something akin to an adoptive father to Rafa, valued discretion, not so much anonymity. Cartel bosses and affiliates often flaunted their impunity, driving through central Guadalajara in convoys of Grand Marquis, escorted by state police, or dining in upscale restaurants and appearing at large official events. Figures like Don Neto and Felix Gallardo passed themselves off as respectable businessmen, mingling with the cream of the political and economic elite. Rafa was young and brash, and he flaunted his impunity not through mafia-style public appearances, but by being a public menace. He was the ultimate loose cannon, gallivanting around, shooting up parked cars in broad daylight, for example, and earning himself scoldings from Don Neto. Don Neto had to intervene on one occasion when, at a nightclub, Rafa's teenage love interest, Sara Cosillo, had flirted with Amado Carrillo Fuentes, future Don of the Juarez cartel. Rafa was so jealous that Don Neto, fearing a wedge within the cartel at best and a bloodbath at worst, allegedly ordered Amado, his nephew, to leave town and help oversee border operations in Ojinaga, Chihuahua. Rafa stayed in Guadalajara, no doubt in part so that Don Neto could keep an eye on him. Like many of the cartel members, Rafa was a cocaine addict, hooked on crack-laced cigarettes, or bazookas, as they called them. And over the years, he became increasingly more erratic and more troublesome for the cartel, especially as his power and wealth grew exponentially. Former Guadalajara bodyguards in particular depict him as bratish, sneering, and hot-tempered. At the same time, though, Rafa's unbridled antics made him a welcome and contagious personality to have around. Cartel members were usually of the same stock. They partied a lot, for example. And we're not talking one-night parties till the early hours of the morning. No, we're talking parties that could go on for up to 10 days, almost non-stop. With these came unimaginable reserves of drugs and alcohol, not to mention huge barbecues and gourmet meals prepared by acclaimed chefs across Mexico, mariachi bands, prostitutes. It was at these sorts of parties where Caro Quintero was most in his element. An American witness recalled once catching Rafa, quote, on a dancing horse, smoking cocaine like an animal. But the term animal doesn't quite capture the most disturbing fact of all, that it was at one of these parties, at 881 Lope de Vega in downtown Guadalajara, where Kiki Camarena and pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar were savagely tortured for over 30 hours. Their capture was cause for wild celebration, their sadistic brutalization a mere party feature. In 1985, the world saw Caro Quintero on film. They saw a disarmingly charming man in his mid-30s with a Colgate smile, jet black eyes and rugged looks. He laughed easily, he cracked jokes with journalists and seemed totally insouciant about his imminent incarceration for the torture murder of a DEA agent. For American audiences, the impertinence was infuriating.
Quieren extraditarte a Estados Unidos.
¿Qué más no querrán? Pues sí, yo también quisiera muchas cosas, pero no se puede.
It gets worse.
Oye, Rafa, ¿tú te consideras un ser malo?
No. Porque si algo tengo es corazón para todo el mundo.
¿Estás enamorado actualmente?
Siempre me he enamorado yo.
¿Sí?
Claro que sí.
¿De varias o de una sola persona?
Las quiero a todas las mujeres yo.
¿Ah,
porque
sí?
nací de una mujer.
Rafa saw himself as something of a ladies' man. His alias was El Príncipe, the Prince, whether self-dubbed, designated, or both. You can see why, with his playfulness, his youthful vaquero swagger, and through his power and wealth, his appeal perhaps with a certain brand of the opposite sex. But then, this would be ignoring more disconcerting sides to the fabled womanizer. The man was essentially a sexual predator. His former bodyguards revealed they took part in what was tantamount to kidnappings. While chauffeuring for the drug lord, from the car window, Rafa would sometimes lay eyes on a woman who took his fancy. He would then order his minions to stop the car and invite, in inverted commas, the young lady in for a session on wheels with the so-called prince, and some could be as young as 16. Light on the Prince Charming, heavy on the damsel in distress. In an interview, an ex-gunman said Rafa was sometimes able to calm some of the ladies down. But we can only imagine the sorts of offers he made and how many of these were offers not to be refused. It's said there were cases who did refuse because of their faith. So Rafa would summon a priest on his payroll. Said priest would then officiate an impromptu marriage for Rafa to proceed with deflowering the lucky bride. It's perhaps to no surprise that the psychologist hired to work on Rafa while he was an inmate at Altiplano prison likened him to a walking phallus. Sara Cosillo was the teenage daughter of a former education minister in the state of Jalisco and the niece of a former governor. Rafa's tumultuous affair with a young socialite has now entered Mexican folklore as a wild and passionate narco-romance. What's understated is simply the scale of the relationship's toxicity, if we can even call it a relationship. Sarah was 17 when Rafa began making advances on her. It's said they met at a Guadalajara nightclub where the urban elite mingled in wild, drug-fueled parties. Anecdotes about the affair are copious. As with many celebrity stories from Mexico's rumor mills, the lines between myth and fact are extremely blurred. It's said that the second or third time he saw her was at a restaurant owned by Don Neto. Sarah was out with a man. A jealous Rafa wanted to kill him for the affront. Softened by Sarah's pleas, though, the suitor was spared, even if he was beaten up and kicked out of the restaurant. Another anecdote is told by one of Rafa's henchmen, later a DEA informant, lending the story more authenticity. He said Rafa tried to win Sarah over by gifting her a white Ford convertible. When Sarah refused it, Rafa sent it again. Sarah resorted to dousing it with gasoline and setting it on fire. Another version of dubious authenticity has it that Rafa burned not one but several cars on the property of Sarah's parents, angry that they had refused to recognize their relationship and that they had refused Rafa's gifts. In 1984, Caro allegedly kidnapped Sarah before returning her for Christmas and lavishing her parents with gifts, soon to be refused. In an alleged note sent to her parents, also of dubious authenticity, Rafa wrote, quote, "I'm in love with your daughter and want to marry her. You had better forget her, or many people in your family will die." One thing is certain though, Sarah was sharing a bed with Rafa when he was arrested and detained in Costa Rica. Their location was traced by the DEA through a call made by Sarah back to Mexico. Sarah's parents had told law enforcement that Rafa had abducted Sarah on the 7th of March after the family was walking home from a disco. This was 2 days after the mutilated bodies of Kiki and Alfredo were discovered in a park on the outskirts of Guadalajara, forcing Rafa to flee the country. Whether this was a real abduction, whether it was a staged one with Sarah's consent, isn't known for certain. She had a reputation for being just as much of a wild card as Rafa, with a spoiled, coquettish attitude to match. Rafa wasn't prime mover in Kiki's abduction for the purposes of his interrogation. As I discussed in part 1 of the series, it was a joint clandestine operation involving cartel bosses, cartel affiliates within the state, and special intelligence officers, both Mexican and North American. That said, there is plenty of evidence that Rafa prolonged Kiki's brutal torture up to the point of death, ordering his final blow. Now, there are many who glorify Rafa as a sort of Robin Hood figure, as a David against Goliath, a self-made businessman who defied corrupt state officials, as well as capitalist drug addicts north of the border. Besides Rafa's measly contributions to Mexican public works relative to his actual wealth, not to mention the slave-like conditions of thousands of peasants toiling his agro-farms, his fan base should perhaps hear the details of Kiki's torture and death before even thinking of praising him. I would urge anybody confronted with narco-glorifiers to remind them of this too. On the 7th of February 1985, Kiki was abducted by bought Jalisco state cops outside the US consulate in Guadalajara. He was blindfolded and driven out to a safe house, recently purchased by Rafa in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood in Guadalajara. Rafa was there waiting, with Don Neto on the patio. When Kiki arrived, Rafa taunted him, slapped him in the face, then punched him hard in the stomach. There was a brief exchange in which the blindfolded Kiki identified the assailant as Rafa. Incensed, Rafa dealt Kiki another vicious blow to the body before ordering DFS agents to take him to the maid's quarters. There, for over 30 hours, Kiki was tortured by drug traffickers, DFS agents, CIA operatives, politicians, and military and police officials. They took it in turns to taunt, beat, and interrogate the man, hog-tied with the cord from the Venetian blinds in the room. He was slapped, kicked, and beaten. They waterboarded him. They burned his body and face with cigarettes. They put gunpowder from their AK-47 cartridges over his face and neck and lit it on fire. They pulled out chunks of his hair. They laid him on the floor and kicked him. High on crack, some torturers climbed onto the bed and jumped onto his body, crushing his ribs. They burned him with electrical coils and jabbed him with an ice pick. Kiki was also raped through the anal cavity with a broom handle. All this with intermittent pleas from Kiki to end the savagery, to kill him. Every time the requests were denied, even if Kiki had no answer to the questions. On the morning of the second day, Kiki, mutilated, concussed, and swollen beyond recognition, was unresponsive. A physician working for the DFS was called in. Dr. Humberto Machain injected lidocaine into his heart, an antiarrhythmic agent which causes the heart to vibrillate faster, pumping blood back to the brain. It enables even a severely injured person to regain consciousness. Kiki's torture was prolonged. He was given shot after shot of lidocaine on Rafa's orders, giving the torturers brief windows to squeeze information out of him. The trick only lasted for so long. Machain told Rafa Kiki needed to go to a hospital or he would die. Rafa allegedly said, quote, "Let him die or make him talk." The doctor proceeded to wrap a plastic laundry bag around his head, suffocating him to make him talk. Kiki was already slipping into a coma. The doctor told Rafa it was now too late to save him, so Rafa ordered his men to bury him and be done with it. Kiki was given his unceremonious death blow, a piece of rebar to the skull. Later, he was tossed in a shallow pit in the Primavera forest to the west of Guadalajara. Mexican pilot Alfredo Zavala, also sadistically tortured, was buried alive next to him. A few facts worth noting. Based on the evidence, Rafa was one of the cruelest overseers of Kiki's torture and murder. A bodyguard to Ernesto Fonseca, Ramon Lira, noted that when CIA operative Felix Rodriguez and his bodyguards took charge of the interrogation, mainly resorting to waterboarding, there was a semblance of order to the madness. And their interrogation was brief, leaving the room once they were satisfied with the information. Kiki was then back in the hands of cartel members and their DFS affiliates, resorting to the shows of psychopathy and masochism mentioned earlier. Even Don Neto, no stranger to sociopathic homicides himself, was horrified at Kiki's fate on the morning of the second day. He had left the party shortly after Kiki's arrival at the house as he'd felt unwell. When he returned, he was incensed, with Rafa reprimanding him for how the situation had devolved and slapping him in the face for his insolence. There was even a standoff between the capo's bodyguards, diffused when Fonseca stormed out the room. He knew then things would not be the same, that murdering a DEA officer would open Pandora's box. It's also highly unlikely Felix Gallardo would have sanctioned Kiki's torture to the point of death, knowing that it would severely compromise the criminal empire he'd so actively forged over the years. The confrontation between Rafa and Ernesto emphasizes the following. Though there were dozens of cartel members and affiliates who committed atrocities on Kiki and Alfredo while taunting and interrogating him, Rafa and his minions acted with exceptional cruelty even by cartel standards, and were most active in the victims' prolonged torture and ultimate deaths. Now, it's worth taking a closer look at how this savagery could even have occurred. How could the thugs inflict such inhumane suffering on a DEA agent, simply for doing his job? First, the traffickers were operating with incredible levels of impunity, real or imagined. To put it plainly, they felt that Guadalajara, and Mexico more generally, was their kingdom. They were answerable to senior officials in government who could turn them in at any moment, but they knew that the drug trade was far too lucrative and valuable for them to do so, at least not without unforeseeable US pressure. Their frequent public appearances and their brazenly conspicuous residences were all testaments to the fact that they had no need to hide. State collusion stretched right up to Los Pinos, Mexico's White House, with eyewitness reports that the Guadalajara traffickers sent President Miguel de la Madrid regular shipments of cocaine for his own use. Their impunity also increased through a string of brutal murders directly inflicted by the Guadalajara capos after the discovery and seizure of Rancho Buffalo in November 1984. More specifically, it was the absence of any official response that made them believe they could quite literally get away with murder. The first was in early December 1984. Two American couples, Jehovah's Witnesses, going door to door spreading the gospel in Guadalajara, happened on the residence of Ernesto Fonseca. Paranoia was at a high after the various busts throughout 1984. High on crack cocaine, Ernesto ordered his henchmen to seize the North Americans, suspecting them to be DEA agents. The henchmen interrogated them and then concluded that they were simply missionaries. Don Neto pressed ahead though. The missionaries were tortured, the women were raped. Then they were executed, dismembered, and dumped in the Primavera Park. Their remains would stay there for another 5 years. 2 months later, in January of 1985, 2 more US nationals suffered similar fates. John Walker, a journalist and aspiring novelist, along with his friend, Albert Radelet, a dentistry student, stumbled upon a high-end seafood restaurant owned by Rafa. The kingpin was dining there with other cartel members when they seized the Americans in a paranoid frenzy and began beating and maiming the tourists with crack-fueled sadism. Rafa personally captured Radelet and started stabbing him in the face with an ice pick. Joaquin Guzman then slit his throat. Rafa also struck Walker with his handgun, a blow that was so fierce it broke Rafa's weapon. Walker died on the scene from traumatic brain injury. The traffickers celebrated this with a hail of machine gun fire. Outside in the parking lot, Rafa congratulated his henchmen for the noble deed of murdering DEA informants. The tourists' dismembered remains were unearthed over 5 months later, in June 1985, after Rafa and Don Neto had already been detained. I detail these murders not just to highlight Rafa's worrying propensity for extreme violence and his clear lack of remorse thereafter, but to show the sense of invincibility felt by traffickers in the lead-up to Kiki Camarena's abduction and brutal death. If the traffickers could murder 7 hapless Americans, mistakenly believed to be DEA agents, and yet neither US nor Mexican law enforcement had sent in the cavalry, any crime, however heinous, could go unpunished. It gave them the green light for murder with complete impunity. Add to this all the ingredients that throughout history have produced pure evil, and you have the recipe for disaster. To name a few, dehumanization of the other. Kiki was seen as a pest, as a parasite, gathering grassroots intel on syndicate operations and massively endangering the cartel's strength. 2, the feeling of anonymity, as we've seen Rafa and the traffickers thought they were off the radar. 3, diffusion of personal responsibility. Rafa was acting in consort with other cartel leaders, DFS, CIA, and Mexican state officials in the police, military, and the government. Dozens of these personally taunted and tortured the victims. 4, obedience to authority. This is less applicable to Rafa, who considered himself virtual narco-aristocracy, but the important involvement of state representatives would have cognitively and actually licensed extreme violence towards the agent. It certainly applies to the henchmen and interrogators involved in the torture murder who were acting under orders from cartel members and affiliates. 5, conformity to group norms. This was the mafia, after all, where violence both within and between criminal groups is part of the trade. Issues of leaks, snitches, mutinies and overthrows are settled with intimidation and violence. As for between groups, control over routes, resources and territory aren't settled in corporate legal cases, but by guns and knives. Likewise for any disputes more generally. Violence simply comes with the trade. Rafa was bred into it and desensitized to it from a very young age. Now, we won't make any sweeping statements on any personality disorders in the absence of a formal psychological diagnosis. There is a psychological report on Rafa, conducted and written during his incarceration at Altiplano prison by a psychologist who also worked on El Chapo Guzman. The report is said to be released later this year, and I'll be sure to leave a link when it's out. As for any remorse for the bloody crimes, telltale signs of the humanity of a murderer after the facts, I'll leave with you these clips from 1985 and 2016, 31 years apart. The first was filmed in Mexico City, shortly after Rafa's arrest. The second is from a clandestine 2016 interview with Proceso magazine at the request of Rafa to tell his version of the story.
¿Sientes arrepentimiento ahora?
Pues, ¿qué le dijera? Arrepentido nunca estoy. Lo hecho ya está hecho y ya estoy aquí.
Si en algo participé o si en algo estoy involucrado, le pido perdón al gobierno de Estados Unidos, a la DEA y a la familia Camarena también. Estoy muy arrepentido y si cometí algún error, pido perdón.
This final section will offer some snapshots on the sort of man Rafa was and remains in adulthood. I'll largely be drawing from the work of Jesús Lemus, a Mexican journalist whose investigations on corrupt statesmen had him framed on trumped-up charges as a high-ranking drug trafficker. During his 3 years at Puente Grande prison, he interviewed top capos and affiliates of Mexico's cartels, of which an aging Caro Quintero. Lemus's impressions are generally positive. He paints the portrait of a quiet, self-effacing man, a serious temperament with flashes of playfulness and a twinkle in his eye. Rafa does give off this impression in his 2016 interview with Anabel Hernández. Lemus writes at length of the capo's discretion and pensiveness, often catching him alone, carrying out the mandatory daily walk along the central patio's perimeter, refusing offers from guards for company, or sitting on a bench he'd jokingly term his office. Being a senior capo of the old guard, he carried prestige in the prison. It was his bench, and other inmates could only sit on it on special invitation. Even in the weeks after he left Puente Grande, people didn't sit there out of respect. Lemus notes his communication style. Quote, "Whatever discourse was rapidly brought to a close, with clear sentences, clearly explained concepts, nothing left to interpretation." This was a welcome trait to interviewer Anabel Hernández, a veteran journalist of the narco world who's interviewed a great many cartel members throughout her career. In her interviews, his answers, while brief and many of them obvious lies, are direct and no nonsense. Hernández contrasted his style to the broken and inarticulate manner of capos like El Chapo. Though usually caught, mulling over his thoughts and watching other inmates play sports, he enjoyed discussing politics and history. History was a particular interest of his, revealing it was the subject in which he'd read most widely, especially the Mexican Revolution and its causes. On the other end of the intellectual spectrum, he confessed to enjoying tabloid TV and celebrity gossip. Ironically, he bore a grudge towards the Mexican press, accusing them of sensationalism with regard to information on his life, and for having far too much power as jury, judge and executioner in Mexico's public sphere. He therefore repeatedly declined offers for interviews, telling Lemus, quote, "Honestly, I don't have anything to tell them. What I have lived is my life and only my own." Obviously, this statement is deeply problematic, considering the severity of his crimes, the violent termination of innocent people's lives, and the duty to reveal the true story. But his thoughts might explain why it was Anabel Hernández whom he reached out to for the interview, a serious and able journalist not prone to sensationalism or distortion. Hernández noted Rafa was a man who looked after himself. Clean-shaven, jet-black dyed hair, clean clothes, and a slender form likely owing to regular running. The comments echo earlier observations by Lemus. Though Rafa didn't take part in competitive sports like basketball or volleyball, on the grounds he, quote, "didn't like to lose," Rafa took the habit of running for over an hour a day. Lemus also spotted how unusually hygienic he was, in contrast with the vast majority of the inmates at Puente Grande. His cell was always tidy. He'd clean it religiously every 3 days. Usually one of the first to finish his meal and escape the din of the canteen, he'd routinely and vigorously scrub his tray before handing it back to the kitchen. Lemus would later state he took part in all religious activities in prison. Questioned about God by the journalist, Rafa replied he was an avid Christian and was paying for his sins. In the 2018 interview with Hernández, Rafa told her tersely that he feared death. These are perhaps more genuine and telling shows of his faith and humanity than the several churches he allegedly funded during his criminal reign, probably more PR stunts fueling Robin Hood archetypes. A shallow look at his interviews reveals a smiling, soft-tempered and fairly simple man asking for peace and forgiveness. A closer look reveals a man clearly in denial about his past and present criminal activities. That said, the lies are only clear to us thanks to what we know from journalists, anti-narcotics officers and historians, not through his speech or body language. His answers are sometimes extremely persuasive. his capacity for deception and victim playing are revealing. Rafa is behind bars, and if US authorities have their way, he'll stay there for the rest of his life. Take any DEA agent, and they are unlikely to feel any sympathy for the man. Though Rafa has requested to be pardoned and has stated he's done his time, he has in fact only served 28 years of a 40-year prison sentence. The actual crimes for which he was sentenced add up to nearly 200 years. Under Mexican law, he was capped at 40. Reminiscent of the Scorpion and the Frog, Rafa returned to the drug trade after his brief release in 2013, trafficking heroin, marijuana, cocaine and methamphetamine, also igniting turf wars in the state of Sonora, which have cost hundreds of lives. A significant portion of public opinion, particularly in Mexico, is sympathetic towards him and his plight, mainly due to his ailing health and age. I would urge those people to learn about the details and exact nature of his crimes before reconsidering their positions. Either way, Rafa's extradition or not to the US is now largely in the hands of the Mexican government. Let's see how it plays out. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Bye for now.